Far away from Europe, the summer of 1964 saw the Thuds go into action for the first time. Soon they were sporting new camouflage, as they were deployed in larger numbers to bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. From those bases, they launched the campaigns that were to write their name into history. For the F-105, Vietnam was the right place at the right time. Even during their service life up to that time, there had been continued problems with reliability, and as recently as 1962, they had all been grounded. Though those problems had been ironed out, the plague of minor defects and a series of accidents had continued almost up to their first Vietnamese missions. But the Thuds in Vietnam had to earn a completely different reputation as reliable and durable aeroplanes. They also earned a fearsome reputation as weapons. The importance of the Thunderchief in Vietnam can be simply indicated. During the first 5 years of their involvement there, they flew an amazing 75% of all USAF attack missions. If the skies of Vietnam were full of bombs, it was because Thuds put them there. From March 1965, increasing numbers of airstrikes were made on North Vietnam. Predominantly directed at communications targets, the raids relied almost entirely on the F-105s. The planes would heave themselves into the air with their loads of bombs and head for a rendezvous with a tanker near the North Vietnam border. For with the level of external stores they were carrying, and the way that, increasingly, they had to fly flat out all the way across Vietnam, rather than cruising to and from the target, their range had been cut considerably, and even with full tanks, the journeys didn't leave much to spare. Then they flew on into hostile airspace. Production of the 105s had been completed in December 1964. Only 78 of the B model had been built. The majority, 610, had been F-105Ds. The D had acquired an extended nose in accommodating updated all-weather navigation systems, and thus was externally markedly dissimilar to the V. The other 143 were the twin-seat F model. It had always been expected that there would be a twin-seat version of the plane, but 2 earlier twin-seat proposals had been dropped. The Fs were to provide the stock for the later development of the last 105, the G, the Wild Weasel. The workhorse of the bombing raids was the D. The single-seaters abounded on the bases, where the work of war went on 24 hours a day. At the end of each mission, the returning pilot would confer with his crew chief about the performance of the plane and hand it over to him for service. The service record of the 105s in Vietnam was excellent. On any given day, over 90% of the Thuds were ready for work. This figure was higher than the overall average within the USAF, and considering the complexity, workload, and relative scarcity of the big planes, it's all the more outstanding. To keep them in the air, facilities for total maintenance of the planes were built at the bases they flew their missions from, and specialist teams were constantly available to fly in to handle specific problems. Teams of ground crew at the bases carried out the normal turnaround routines, like refueling, filling the water tank in the tail to the afterburner, rearming the plane, and the other servicing required between missions, quickly and efficiently. The body of the plane was a patchwork of hatches, allowing access to the equipment inside. The big fuselage had very little spare room inside it, but the layout was good enough to ensure that servicing was relatively straightforward. The bases were a far cry from the mud and improvisation of the Second World War. A Thunderchief parked on Tak Lee's acres of hardstand could be serviced with relative ease. The wing-point combinations for the next mission were selected and effected, and the plane armed in a smooth and practiced routine. A large part of the bombs dropped on Vietnam were iron bombs of Second World War vintage. Sadly, they were of a design philosophy and era that should have been long gone. However, modern smart bombs were not to really arrive in Vietnam until the F-111s used them. So the 105 missions were often flown to deliver hardware that was uncontrolled in flight, often unstable in trajectory, and sometimes unreliable in effect. But with these bombs, the Thuds hammered the North, and in most instances destroyed their allocated targets. Right through the night, the bases were a hive of activity as the work of repairing, servicing, and arming the planes went on. Another factor that makes the 90% availability of the Thuds even more impressive was their toughness. They kept coming back from missions with major battle damage to repair. The Thuds sustained strikes from SAMs, as well as AAA and MiG cannons, and survived. Each morning, the one-man air forces waited, ready. USAF flew the first of the Rolling Thunder series of strikes. The inclusion of the reference to Thunder is fitting, as throughout its 3 years, Rolling Thunder was to be the almost exclusive province of the Thunderchief. The fuller extension of the air war into the north had 3 purposes. First, to reduce the infiltration of the south. Second, to give pause to the communist leadership in Hanoi. And thirdly, to bolster the morale of the southern leadership and the people of South Vietnam. As the name implies, the strikes rolled forward into the north, targets being progressively further and further over the border. And the thunder was real. The damage to the north's bridges and railways and roads exacted a great cost on the communists and hampered their war effort considerably. However, though at times apparently shaken, the Hanoi leadership did not break. The Thuds flew in on their deadly missions, and the Vietnamese tried, with everything the Russians and Chinese could give them, to knock them from the sky.
Roger, let's go get it.
North Vietnam was not an ideal target for a sustained bombing campaign. There was very little industrial infrastructure to damage, and almost no war production. The country had an agrarian society, predominantly rural and dispersed. The few major targets in terms of docks and storage were within the exclusion zones around Hanoi and Haiphong, the 2 major cities. For political reasons, these areas were not bombed for most of the war, as the US consistently tried to negotiate an end to the fighting in the south. The Thud pilots learned their own ways of coping with the streams of SAMs that rose at them, splitting and diving to confuse and evade the missiles.
We can take it down. Roger, Badger, take it down. We got a launcher here coming off the fender. I think we're all right with the time in. Everything else looks good. Okay, Detroit, let's get out of here to the southwest.
In tangles with the MiGs, the 105s came off well. They had such reserve of power that if a MiG managed to get in position to fire, they could in most cases simply accelerate away from them. Further, the Thuds were capable of turning the tables on their attackers and really nixing it. 28 MiG-17s were downed by 105s. The bombs continued to rain down on Vietnam. Supporting the bombing was an electronics and communications network of unprecedented technical sophistication. Operations controllers directed a huge fleet of varied crafts in the air, at every level from artillery spotter planes to B-52s. They dispatched rescue operations for downed pilots, and coordinated the activities of tankers, bombers, and fighters. Off the coast of North Vietnam prowled the Big Eye planes, act with sensitive radar and alert for the slightest activity from the MiG squadrons. Any appearance of the MiGs was monitored and the information relayed to the fighters in the area. The constant observation, coupled with the air superiority of the Phantoms and Thunderchiefs, served to ensure that for large periods of the war, the Communist Air Force stayed on the ground. The controllers and their equipment directing the airstrikes were themselves part of a chain of command that stretched back from Vietnam through the Pacific headquarters in Hawaii all the way to Washington, where the targets were identified and authorized. At the very end of the chain were the Thuds, setting off daily with their lures.
He's going to get going in a minute. Okay, I got him here.
Thousands and thousands of sorties succeeded one another, with the F-105 carrying most of the load. Whether or not one questions the strategic effect of the program, it is impossible to not acknowledge the burden that the Thunderchiefs carried and the effectiveness with which they pursued their assignments. In June 1967, the first of the Thuds to do so reached the halfway point in their theoretical 4,000-hour fatigue lifetime, to be followed soon by others. The most critical fatigue concern was the strains upon the engines. The missions that the Thuds were flying were unlike anything originally envisaged. They were regularly running at full power with afterburner for extended periods of time. The stress on the power plants was enormous. The hot sections of the huge J-75 engine were particularly vulnerable to this type of treatment. Already there had been some shortages of spares. As a safeguard, the normal engine life between changes was reduced from 200 to 125 hours, and teams of mechanics worked on overhauling the engines, testing them, and reinstalling them on the planes. The 388th Squadron was flying a Thunderchief with 3,000 hours under its belt, having gone out on 500 missions, received flight damage on several occasions, and been involved in a mid-air collision earlier in the year. By October, 3 more had passed the mark. They were growing old fast. An earlier suggestion to reopen the lines and build more F-105s had been considered, then dropped. There was a replacement to much of their work already available in the Phantom, and construction was proceeding apace on their successor, a design that had been much influenced by the story of the Thud, and which reflected many of the lessons learnt in its combat life, the F-111. For the time being, the Thuds remained indispensable, and they were constantly tended to maintain their status and prolong their life. The Thuds remained in Vietnam to the end. Not only the two-seater SAM-suppressing Wild Weasels, but also the Ds and Fs with their bombs, technical support, and electronic countermeasure systems. The Thuds were still workhorses, and right through to the devastating Linebacker 1 and 2 operations that finally brought the North to a negotiating position that allowed the US to withdraw from the conflict. Their bombing had sustained the air war against North Vietnam. There was no other plane at the time that could have done the job. The bombing was fiercely pressed home, and the results devastating, particularly when they were directed against a specific industrial target. The Ho Chi Minh Trail buzzed with activity during the bombing hawks. Illustrating 2 points, the wily resolve of the Vietnamese in pursuit of their aims, and the effectiveness of the bombing. The pilot's tour of duty was 100 missions, and the Thuds saw hundreds of pilots through their tour and home again. They were men who were undoubtedly universally glad to be out of the war, glad to have done their job and survived. However, many of them were to miss their big machines, and the sensation of howling through the air in a huge metal monster at twice the speed of sound. Captain John Piawati began growing his mustache when he first arrived in Vietnam in 1967. When he finished his 100th mission, the mustache was 12¼ inches long. On his 55th mission, his Thud was hit by artillery over the Paul Duma Bridge near Hanoi during a bombing run. His story is typical. Not only did he hit the bridge and bring down a span, but the damaged Thud brought him home to finish his tour. Some of the Wild Weasel and other specialist planes stayed with the USAF after Vietnam, but the 105s were progressively phased out and retired into the hands of the pilots of the Air Force Reserves. There were not too many of them about, and they faded rather quickly from use. The last reserve flight of an F-105 was on the 25th of May, 1983, exactly 25 years after the accident on the first flight of the F-105B. Many pilots sat in the seat of an F-105 and went through the startup process. Many owed their lives to them. Most of them considered their plane the best in the inventory. The big fighter grew from its problem childhood, and the parameters of what an aircraft could be asked to do grew with it. In an era of multiple transitions, it is an astounding achievement that so much was got right so well in one package. There were never very many of them, and their reputation is perhaps not widespread. But if the words great plane can be ascribed to any plane, then they can certainly be ascribed to the F-105 Thunderchief, the Thud.
This is Bob Hoover of North American Aviation, who always gives a tremendous display of precision flying with his North American P-51.
He used to be a test pilot, one of the best. Today, he's manager of customer relations for North American's Los Angeles division, and he's the man who demonstrates this plane.
I guess I was fairly apprehensive the whole time that I was flying in combat, and I guess there's good reason to feel that way. I'm there to cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm, and therefore they would like to damage me. And I was 25 years old at that time. Top Gun was really a thrill. I must have done well in actual combat because at the time I was just a lieutenant junior grade, which is a first lieutenant in the Air Force. And so I may have been the very first lieutenant junior grade to go through Top Gun.
I grew up in Bremen, Georgia, about an hour west of here. Graduated from high school there. Came to Georgia Tech 1952. Met Pat Epps along the way. We graduated in 1956. I had been accepted for pilot training with the Air Force after ROTC, but was delayed for a year on that to go on active duty. So I worked for Lockheed out here in Marietta. And then in 1957, I entered pilot training down in Bainbridge, Georgia. I was very fortunate, flew the first group that flew the T-37. Went from there to Laredo, Texas, T-33, and got my wings. Came back to Moody Air Force Base flying F-86Ls.
Jim Sursely from Florida returned from his service in Vietnam, a triple amputee.
Well, very fond memories of growing up in Rochester, Minnesota. Great town, great place to be a kid. Spent a lot of time playing Little League baseball, basketball, football, all those kind of things. Had a large family. Always looked forward to Thanksgiving dinners, Christmases together, that type of thing, and just sharing our life together. Well, I joined the Army to be a wheeled vehicle mechanic, to work on Jeeps and trucks. The second advanced individual training I took at Fort Sill was for self-propelled tracks and howitzers, tanks and armored personnel carriers, to do the maintenance work on those. And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't much of a garrison soldier. It wasn't what I joined the Army to do. I felt like I wanted to make a stronger contribution than what I was doing with the 24th Infantry Division in Germany. And because of that, I went down and talked to the first sergeant and said, Top, I'd like to volunteer to go to Vietnam. I've given this a lot of thought. I've talked to a lot of the guys that are in the unit that have come back from Vietnam, and it's truly something I think I want to do.
We're hit on by the number 3 engine back here, and there's a gas tank in there, caught fire, and Steve King, the pilot, is telling us to bail out, the plane is going down. I was hooked up to the electrical supply for my electrically heated suit, and I had my headset on, so I had to disconnect those things. I got down here on this little deck, which is right under the pilot's seats here above. And I started to debate with myself about what I was going to do. We'd been given the bailout order, and I was thinking it over. But you only didn't have much time to do that. And you're going to do what? You're going to jump out now and let myself fall forward out this way. The plane blew up. One of the gunners was killed, but the rest of us were out of there. We were scattered. The people jumped out at various times. And I said 2 guys landed in the wrong place, fell into the hands of civilians who killed them. And Miller, the pilot, co-pilot, was shot to death with a parachute. I just landed in the spot where it happened to be a suburban area, right across the street from a military hospital, and I could see the German soldiers leaning out the window. They're watching me come down.
Well, that was nice.
I get down. Now what you were supposed to do, you're supposed to hide your parachute. Well, so I hid my parachute. They're all watching me. And 2 soldiers drive up in a car, and they had their pistols out, and I put my hands up. And war was over for me at that point.
On our 5th mission, we hadn't had a lot of problems before that. 5th mission, sitting here, bombardier sitting up where Scott is. All of a sudden I hear "plock," and look, the bombardier comes flying off his seat and landed right here on his back. I didn't know what happened to him. What happened was a piece of flak flew through the glass there, and it made that sound, "plock," and bombardier's name was Charlie. Charlie, he's laying there. He said, "Okay, I think I'm all right. But I mean, that was kind of like, then I knew they were shooting at us. That the little things, when I just look at that, I just remember that again. That sound. I can never forget that sound. Plock. I remembered that.
A World War II airfield encampment recreated at Oshkosh brought back memories still vivid after more than 65 years. Younger aviation enthusiasts were eager to hear about the veterans' experience.
You had to bail out, yes.
I had to bail out, yes.
You did, not me.
No, I took his place, actually, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I finally forgave him after all these years for letting me
I
take
wasn't
his
there
place.
that day.
No, I was in the Great Escape Camp for 6 months, and then they moved us to another camp, and finally liberated by General Patton. I saw him in person.
So this kind of brings back some memories, seeing this stuff.
And look at the chest pack parachute here.
Yep.
You know, when I wore the chest pack for a long time. Then I had this one mission where we got shot up and dropped out of the formation. And when I got back from that mission, I said, no more chest pack. I don't want to be looking around, where the hell is it?
Did you get a
So
seat
I
back
got a backpack.
or backpack?
So I changed my parachute and I wore it in and out. From then, every mission I wore the parachute and my armored flak vest from takeoff to landing.
For Jack and Don, the climax was a flight on Thunderbird, a beautifully restored aircraft painted in the colors of a B-17 that flew 112 bombing missions in Europe. It takes dedication, hours of hard work, and eye-watering amounts of money to maintain and fly this old warbird. The Lone Star Flight Museum of Galveston, Texas, keeps her flying as a living memorial to the men and women of the 8th Air Force in World War II.
I haven't been up in that thing since 1944.
Well,
Looking pretty good, isn't it?
yes. I'm still amazed that these things still fly.
For this trip, they chose the relative comfort of the radio compartment located behind the bomb bay.
Look at that. They didn't have insulation at that time. I mean, you just had the bare metal. And everything rattled. You could hear yourself think. And it was cold. Because something like this.
The bomb bay looks very small.
I know, it doesn't.
You can see all the way up to the flight deck there, too. Right?
Yeah.
This is really something. Really something. You know, flying again. 66 years later. I can't believe it. Here we go, Jack.
dissipates before my eyes, buried under endless pavement and concrete.
We are truly a band of brothers, of people who are Vietnam veterans, and the people I was with in Vietnam to this day, if they called me up and asked me for anything, I would be right there to help them, because it was an experience that we all shared that it's hard for anyone else to enter into that experience.
I stare outside my window, the seasons change. I cannot live here anymore.
It means a lot. I don't. It's hard to explain. It's in your heart, but to see all the veterans and think about all those that can't be here. So I sure appreciate everything they're doing for the rest of us that are left.
Interestingly enough, the best music in Vietnam came from Hanoi, Hanoi. We got to get out of this place.
Must be something we can do now. down this charade, this fool's parade, the legacy we're leaving for our children.
If you could take the genes from the consummate military leader and combine them with the genes of the consummate fighter pilot, the result might look just like this. However, if you created a fictional military hero with Brigadier General Robin Olds' resume, an editor would likely reject it for being beyond believable. In 1942, Olds was an All-American tackle for West Point. In 1943, he was commissioned a second lieutenant and completed pilot training. He entered World War II flying a P-38 he named Scat-1. As he progressed through different iterations of fighter planes, he simply kept adding Roman numerals to the Scat name. He finished the war in a P-51 named Scat-7. In addition to becoming a double Ace Plus with 12 aerial victories, he destroyed another 11 1/2 aircraft on the ground. He later became the wingman on the Air Force's first aerobatic jet team. In 1966, he became commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, Thailand. Robin Olds flew 152 combat missions in Southeast Asia in F-4 Phantoms, 105 of them over North Vietnam. He shot down 2 North Vietnamese MiG-17s and 2 MiG-21s. Robin Olds was famous for something else. He never learned to mince words or play politics with the mission of the military, as those in the Warbirds in Review audience learned when Olds described his return from Vietnam.
I got home about the last day of September, 1st of October, on a Friday. My family in Washington, and I'm on leave. Phone rang Saturday. Said, get over here to the Pentagon. Chief of Staff wants to see you Monday morning. I said, I'm on leave. He said, doesn't matter, the chief wants to see you. I said, yes, sir, okay. I reported into his office. He's the one that walked up to me and said, take off that mustache. Yes, sir. The next thing I knew, he briefed me, and I'm in the Oval Office of the White House. You know, God, me? LBJ was the president. So I'm sitting on the end of a couch. He's on an easy chair, and his aide, a colonel, Air Force colonel, was sitting on my right. And Mr. President said, welcome home, Colonel. You did well. Thank you very much, sir. Yeah, well, what's it like to be home? That was the weekend that thousands and thousands of hippies marched on the Pentagon. I said, sir, who are all those funny-looking people that marched on the Pentagon yesterday? And I'm going to quote for you folks. He said, I got 240,000 boys over there in Vietnam. When those boys come home, they'll tell the American public what's happening. And I thought, wait a minute. That's your job, not mine. Well, of course, you don't say that. So the best thing I could think of to come up with, sir, I've been home since Friday. Been to a couple of dinner parties. No one asked me where I've been or what I've been doing for the past year. In case somebody does ask, what would you like me to tell them? I'm thinking, end of career. He glared at me, and then he said, well, Colonel, you tell them, I'm quoting, that we are preventing the North Vietnamese from interfering in the democratic process in South Vietnam. I said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't say that. Well, why not, Colonel? Well, sir, if that's why we're there, I don't want to be the one that spreads the word. Ooh. It was grim for a few minutes, but I hand the man full credit. He let me talk. He listened. And he sent me down the next morning to talk to his chief security advisor in the basement of the White House. We argued for a couple of hours. But this security advisor and I argued. At one point I said something. He said, "You know we can't do that. That'll bring down the Chinese." I said, "The Chinese and the North Vietnamese have hated each other for a couple of thousand years. They fought wars against each other. Haven't you read their history?" No, he hadn't. So finally he said, "What do you think we ought to do?" And I said, "For God's sakes, sir, mine the harbors, because everything they use came in by ship bottom. Gas, missiles, ammunition, everything, food." His response, when I said mine the harbors, was, "We can't do that. That's an act of war." Now mind you, this was about the 2nd or 3rd of October of 1967. I wonder if he ever wondered what the hell we were doing over there. Now, it was, I maintain we had every reason to be there, but we went about it improperly under the leadership of McNamara and Johnson.
He became the first P-47 pilot to score 5 victories on the same mission.
We would fly close formation 45 minutes ahead of the bombers into Frankfurt, and then we'd split up like this in a fan, and I was in this westernmost flight. We were supposed to fly 15 minutes and then do a reciprocal on that heading and come back. Well, I completed a 15 minute, turned around and come back, and I heard everywhere I listened, everybody was seeing bogeys. The Germans were all over the place. And shortly after that, I looked in front of me, and there's a gaggle of 109s, close formation, still had their tanks on. So with my flight of 4, I pressed the attack, and they saw us coming, and all of a sudden, all those tanks went off at the same time, and they don't go down like a bomb. They flutter. And I'd never seen that. That got my attention, but only for a short time, and I pressed on to make the attack. And they saw us coming, obviously, and then the whole gaggle did split S's. They went in every direction. And I picked out 2 and tied onto them, and away we go. Nothing could dive with the P-47. But we did know this, that the 109 supposedly could not pull out if it was vertical at 5,000 feet. Well, it saved my life knowing that, because I'm really concentrated. And you have tunnel vision when you're getting ready to fire. And I'm watching this, all of a sudden the wings start to flutter, and it looked pretty sad. Something was about to happen. So I looked at my speed indicator, and I was doing 575 straight down, and right away I got both hands on the stick. Felt like it was in concrete. We're approaching compressibility. So long story short, the 109 splashed. I pulled out just above the tree level and got up out of there. So that was my first victory on that day, and I got up to 8,000 feet. You're always climbing for altitude. I got to 8,000, I looked down, there's a lone 109 flying by itself, going east. Made a pass down on, gave him a good burst, and it did 2 violent snap throw, boom, boom, and turned and went straight in. So that was the second one. So I pulled up from that, started to climb, and our leader, Hub's empty, Fairbanks leader, I'm 10 miles south of Koblenz. I'm over the whole Luftwaffe. That's quite a statement. I make this great big wide orbit, and it wasn't like a mile, it was a big wide orbit. Before I could get on with somebody without somebody immediately on my tail. Finally, I sound 2, they're only about 50 feet apart. I pulled onto one to the left. They didn't move, they didn't do anything to evade me. I gave them a good burst. Smoke started to come from it, and the right gear fell out. So it started a slow spiral going down. I just had a little right rudder. Same thing happened to that one. His right gear fell out. And it was the 2 of them going spiraling down together. That was my 3rd and 4th of that day. So about that time, I looked over, and there's a 109 climbing up onto Hub Zemke's butt. And I called to him, and I said, "Break," He said, "Where is it?" And like a dumb lieutenant, I said, he's climbing right up under your ass. And I thought he'd get all over me when we got back to briefing, but he didn't say one thing about that. And I managed to just get a few short bursts around the cockpit. Excuse me, I didn't think I had him, but the airplane slid off to the right and the pilot bailed out. And that was my fit for the mission.
So I came in, I hit the spot, got down on the ground, safe, and here were the true heroes in that. My crew chief and medic looked at me and I said, go get them. And here we're sitting in a minefield, nobody's moving. Everybody's dead or wounded. They start running through the minefield, and they're carrying the patients back to the aircraft. And I'm sitting in the right seat looking out the door, and boom, they step on a mine or set off a mine. And they got a great big guy on a litter, and I think he saved my two guys. The rest of the shrapnel went into the aircraft and him, and then the concussion just blew them up in the air. They land, they put him on the aircraft, and they go back and get the rest of the patients.
If John Wayne plays you in a movie, it would seem you've led an extraordinary life. In The Flying Tigers, John Wayne is said to have modeled his character after David Lee Tex Hill, one of the original American Volunteer Group, or AVG, Flying Tigers. In order to appreciate what the Flying Tigers did, you first have to understand the importance of the task they undertook. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. Within 5 months, 1 million Chinese people were under Japanese control. By the end of 1937, all of the major cities in China were captured, including Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's capital of Nanking. Claire L. Chenault, a retired U.S. Army Air Corps officer, was serving as an aviation advisor to Chiang Kai-shek during the Sino-Japanese War. The Chinese Air Force was non-existent. Generalissimo Chiang and Chenault sought and received U.S. permission to recruit Army, Navy, and Marine aviators and have them resign their commissions to join a contract volunteer force to defend China. The AVG Flying Tigers were born, and Tex Hill was one of its original recruits. China is a vast nation, and it valiantly fought on against the Japanese, even though there were 2 million Japanese soldiers in China by 1941. But in May of 1942, China nearly capitulated. Its supply lifeline was the 717-mile Burma Road, which ran from Lashio in Burma to Kunming in China. In May, the Japanese overran the American, British, and Chinese forces in Burma and completed the blockade of China. Soon, the Japanese 56th Division, the vaunted Red Dragons, were pouring up the road into China with only one remaining obstacle, the Salween River. An expansion bridge across the mile-deep river gorge had been destroyed by the retreating Chinese. But the Japanese had gone down to the river and already had a pontoon bridge under construction. That set the stage for one of the most memorable aerial combat missions in history. On May 7, 1942, Tex Hill and 3 other Flying Tigers in well-worn P-40s dived into the river gorge carrying 500-pound Russian-made bombs.
I led that mission on the 7th of May, 1942. So, if you knew your history, why, Rama was just about in Cairo at that time. Now, the Japanese had plans to go into India. If China had collapsed, the Indians would have turned on the Brits and slaughtered them like pigs. And it's conceivable that the Japanese and the Germans would have linked up across India and Africa, and we'd have had a different situation in the world. we probably wound up with some sort of negotiated peace, because we didn't have the atomic bomb at that time. Of course, that solved everything, but that was almost 3 years later. Now, on May the 7th, when I was asked to lead a mission, the Chinese had blown the bridge, the main bridge there, but the Japanese had started building a pontoon bridge across. So I took a force of 8 planes. 4 of us were Navy guys that come out of a dive bombing squadron. We were loaded up with these big Russian bombs of 550 pounds roughly, and some frags on the wings. And I got up there and I saw that that pontoon bridge wasn't all the way across. Where that road winds down, that gorge is about a mile deep, and the road is cut back into the mountain. And so I was lucky enough to hit the road above with a bomb and knock the edge of the road off. And if I hit above it and I had a landslide, they could shovel it off, and it wouldn't be any big problem. But when I knocked the edge of that road off, now they got to excavate back into that mountain, and that's rock, you know. But anyway, it blocked them, and for 3 days, they had no place to go. I mean, we slaughtered these guys. I don't know how many people we killed there, bombing and strafing them for 3 days. I don't think people have ever really understood the significance of that Salween mission. And now the people who were involved in that do, but none of the historians have really picked up on it and understand that this could have been an entirely different world, you know, if that mission had failed.
What put you on a track to go into ROTC and then into the Air Force? Is that something you wanted to do since you were a kid, or when did that kick in for you?
Well, growing up during World War II, formative years, I heard about these guys, flying tigers, running around China, strafing trains and doing things in the big raids. And I thought that must be really neat.
I'm Colonel Bud Anderson, and I'm going to do you might say, a walk-around on a P-51B Bravo airplane. This particular airplane right here is painted exactly like my airplane was painted in World War II. It's been restored by Jack Roush, and he's done a marvelous job of restoring it. And one of the main features, of course, is the Malcolm hood, which is quite a modification on the P-51Bs and Cs. Bs and Cs had what we call a birdcage canopy, and you opened it like this over the top like that, and of course it had slats on the thing, and of course when you're looking out, the damn slat is right there by your eye. And so these were marvelous improvement for a pilot to look around in aerial combat. Well, when you did a walk around in the morning, you usually came out from operations and walked out to your airplane. Your crew chief would meet you somewhere in the area, and then you go over the paperwork and sign the Form 1A, the maintenance records on the airplane that the military kept at the time, and discuss anything about the airplane if you wanted. Of course, this was my own personal airplane, and I knew it very well, and I had a wonderful crew, ground crew. That was the dream of a lifetime come true. I had wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot just like my dad from the time I was 10 years old. STS-27 was my third launch, and it was only the second launch after the Challenger accident. We were a top secret, classified Department of Defense mission. So, to this day, if I told you what we carried, you could never leave this hangar.
I never felt that I was any better than any other pilot. I just felt this is what I want to do, and I want to do it to the best of my ability.
If you're interested in or involved with aviation, you'll likely know something about Robert Anderson Bob Hoover. Yet he did so much and touched so many during his long life and career that even his admirers might be surprised at all that he did. On the other hand, if you're not familiar with the history and evolution of American aviation, there really is no quick way to describe the true American hero, the authentic national treasure known as Bob Hoover. The immortal aviation pioneer, Medal of Honor recipient, and Air Force General, Jimmy Doolittle once called Bob the greatest stick and rudder man that ever lived. I don't know, but I'd take Jimmy's word for it. Bob was certainly the best I ever saw. But there is no Bob Hoover elevator speech. I can't tell you he was the first pilot to solo across an ocean nonstop, or a combat fighter ace. He wasn't the first pilot to exceed the speed of sound, or to walk on the moon. But I can tell you that Bob Hoover had the complete respect and admiration of the pilots who did those things. They knew that Bob Hoover not only possessed a transcendental gift for flying airplanes, but also a set of core values that invariably drove him to do the right thing for his fellow pilots, for his employer, for his country, for aviation. I was honored to be one of the celebrants of his memorial service when he left us in late 2016.
Well, I will never forget, we maneuvered the arm, and Mike Mullane was my arm operator, so he moved the arm over there, and we brought up the television image of the right wing, and I looked at what I was seeing, and I said to myself, we are gonna die.
Jim Sursely served as a mechanic and machine gunner on an armored personnel carrier with the 17th Armored Cavalry, 196th Light Infantry of the Americal Division. After 4 months in country, his leadership qualities brought him a promotion to vehicle commander and squad leader.
I was honored to be selected to have that position. I enjoyed what I was doing, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to spend any more tours in Vietnam with what we were experiencing at that time. I did truly enjoy the military and love the life.
10 months into Sursely's tour, everything changed for him.
And I mean, it was a routine day like many others that we had a daily operation, search and clear, sweeping villages to make sure that they were clean of either NVA or Viet Cong looking for weapons, that type of thing. And as it got on towards evening, we were looking to pick a night logger position where we could set up for the night, stay there overnight, and then continue operations the next morning. When I came off the track, I went out to get some equipment on the perimeter of the area we set up on and stepped on a landmine. Turned out to be estimated at about 25 pounds of TNT. It traumatically amputated both of my legs and my left arm. I got on the dust-off helicopter and went to the hospital just about like you see me now. The amazing thing about what happened that day was it was an all-powder explosion. There was no shrapnel to it whatsoever. It was not contained or encased in metal. That ball of flame cauterized my arteries and kept me from bleeding to death. Never lost another drop of blood from the explosion on, and laid there on my back while the medic worked on me and never lost consciousness. actually carried on a conversation with our medic before the dust-off helicopter got there. I don't remember much of the helicopter flight from the explosion on. I remember getting to the 95th Evac Hospital when I first got there. It was a very quiet day. There was no need to triage me because they had plenty of staff available to work on me. I came in and out of consciousness during that 3-day period of time while I was there because I had troops from my outfit came up to visit, and I remember the conversations I had with them. Nobody came up and felt sorry for you. I mean, even 24, 48 hours after my injury, I actually had guys come up and say, "Sursely, you look like crap," you know. I mean, that's just the way Vietnam veterans treated each other. That was the nicest greeting you could ever get if they addressed you in that manner. So just the fact that they were there to come and visit, know that you were severely injured and you were going to move on to someplace else was a real heartfelt expression on their part, and it was taken that way too.
At what point in your Air Force career did you get introduced to the F-105?
I was in graduate school at Southern California in 1965-66. And while I was there, I was thinking I'm going to miss out on this war because I had a lot of friends that already had assignments. But I received an assignment at the time before I finished out there for the 105. And the sequence of events was I'd go to survival school at the completion and then to Nellis Air Force Base and check out in the 105 to go to Tak Lee, Thailand.
So when you were at Nellis, how often did you get into Las Vegas?
Surprisingly, I didn't go down there as much as you'd think during that time. We were pretty busy. I went out a few times to make sure I wasn't going to win any extra money.
In an airplane, the guy was a mongoose. It's hard to believe if the only Bud Anderson you knew was the one on the ground. Calm, gentlemanly, a grandfather, funny, an all-round nice guy. But once you got him in an airplane, he's vicious. Shot down 17 airplanes. Best fighter pilot I've ever seen. The man who spoke those words would certainly be in a position to know. He flew with Bud Anderson in England as part of the celebrated 357th Fighter Group. Bud became a triple ace in the P-51 Mustang, racking up 16 1/4 kills over 2 tours of duty. Flying 116 missions in his venerable Old Crow, Anderson was so skilled that he was never hit by an enemy aircraft and never turned back for any reason. In fact, he can only recall one occasion when an enemy pilot was able to get behind him. Little wonder that General Chuck Yeager called him the best he's ever seen. There were 30 years of continuous service for this soft-spoken farm kid from Central California, including some of the most dangerous post-war flight testing done by the Air Force. Commanding a squadron of F-86 jets in Korea, and 25 combat missions in F-105s during the Vietnam War. To understand Bud Anderson, you have to understand just how much flying means to him. And he won't try to tell you that. He once wrote, "How do you explain this sort of feeling to those who don't fly? How do you explain color to somebody blind from birth?
I was a NASA astronaut until I was 50 years old. And so I looked at the situation, and I had known a number of Southwest airline pilots. And they were just like me. They were flying because they loved to fly. Well, there's a lot of piloting that goes into it, a tremendous amount of piloting that goes into it, because you're going to wind up passing other airplanes. You're going to get in a duel with another airplane that's fairly closely matched. So there's a ton of satisfaction from doing that. And hey, let's just talk about the racing itself. It's fun to fly low, but it's dangerous. And so the only time I fly low is at the Reno air races. But watching the ground go by you at 400 and 500 miles an hour is pretty darn thrilling, because it's really scooting on by. And that's fun. That's really fun. I had always been fascinated by racing planes because they're sleek, streamlined, and they go real fast. There's that need for speed again, and they're raced around a pylon. And so I determined that I could break the existing altitude record for altitude and horizontal flight for that category of airplane. And in fact, I did that in 1991. And I'm fond of saying that if I have done well as an aviator, it's because my dad was the one who taught me how to fly. And he didn't just teach me how to fly, he taught me the why of it as well. He taught me the aerodynamics behind it, the reasons that you're doing things, not just how to do it, but why you're doing it is also very important.
Tell me as much as you can remember about your journey to Vietnam. How did they get you over there? Did you fly an airplane over there, or did they ship you some other way? Just tell us about going to Vietnam and your first impressions of being there.
Okay. I left from Fort Walton Beach, Eglin Air Force Base, in the end of March of 1967. I flew commercially to San Francisco and then up to Travis Air Force Base, where I was on a military contract flight that island hopped to the Philippines, Clark Air Base, and I went through jungle survival school there for about 10 days. And then I flew again on a contract flight to Bangkok, and then on a military airplane, C-47, the old Goonie Bird, up to Tak Lee.
And what do you remember about stepping off an airplane for the first time?
I had a very memorable introduction. The fellow who was the ops officer for my squadron and the one that became my flight commander subsequently said, "Welcome to the 354th, the highest loss rate squadron in Southeast Asia." I said, "Yeah, what a good deal." And about a week later, I went up and met with the wing commander who welcomed the new people, and he told us that in 2 years of operation, the track record was in the 100 missions or 1 year tour, you had a 50-50 chance of being shot down. If you were shot down, you had a 50-50 chance of being rescued. Welcome to the war.
I flew all of my combat missions, 116, with 480 hours and 20 minutes of combat flying without a single abort for any reason whatsoever. That's pretty remarkable, actually. Having said what my combat record was, 116 missions without an abort, leads me to my crew chief story, which I like to tell whenever I can. You know, I think you could imagine yourself being a crew chief of an airplane, World War II. Your pilot's doing the fighting and the dying, and you're back here maintaining that airplane. You know, if you're the crew chief, that's your airplane, and you're a part of it. And when that guy gets a kill and puts it up in here, that's your kill too. The guys were very, very supportive and wanted to do their part. Just incredible. And the story I like to tell, my crew chief story, is about my second tour when I had a P-51D Dog, the classic model over here. And it was camouflaged in this dark green camo, completely, just about like this airplane here. And it was my second tour, and Otto Heino had been promoted to tech sergeant, and crew chiefs were staff sergeants. So he had a flight of 6 airplanes to oversee. And so he handpicked a new crew chief for me, Mel Schooneman. And then, of course, the third member of my crew was Leon Zimmerman, who was my armor. All 3 of those guys were my crews during World War II, and also during my P-39 training. So, as the story goes, in my second tour, I have the completely camouflaged D, and I think it was in November of 1944. I remember it was snowing over Germany, and snow had hit the night before, and I mean a big time snow, and all of northern Germany and northern Europe was in dense snow. And I looked down. We used to fly in the fingertip 4, a leader and a wingman and a element leader and a wingman. And I looked down against the here's a nice white surface right here with the flying on 4. And at this point in time, we weren't paying too much attention to the paint schemes. And we had all green ones, we had all silver ones, we had some that were in half camo and half silver. And I'm looking down at this snow, and which one stood out? Well, of course, the dark one stood out. The camouflaged airplane stood out. So I made a mental note to talk to my crew when I got back to after the mission. When I landed, I got them together and I said, you know, it's snowing over there and I'm going to finish my tour in the winter. Whenever this thing is laid up for heavy maintenance, would you please depaint it, take the camo off of it and make it a silver paint scheme. And I put it to them on a tactical basis that it might save my butt. But frankly, you know, I had another reason. That was one reason, but I kind of thought the all silver airplanes looked a little cooler than the all camoed airplanes. So I told them that, and I thought it would take, you know, 2 or 3 days to do that. And I did tell them, when it's laid up for heavy maintenance, please repaint the airplane. So I went in and I was the operations officer, and I decided that I wanted to fly the next day, put my name on the board, and went home and forgot about it. Next morning after breakfast and getting the briefing, come out, I grabbed my chute in operations And I walked out to my revetment. I'm the closest. My revetment was easy walking distance from operation. I had my parachute over my shoulder, and I climb up over the revetment, and I standing there looking down, and here's my Mustang sitting there in gleaming aluminum. And I was really quite flabbergasted. You know, I thought, wow, did those guys think I gave them a direct order to do that? And then I looked at them closely, and I noticed their hands were raw. You know, the skin had been pushed off of them, and they'd been rubbing, and there was a little bit of blood on them. And that made me feel really, made me feel like hell. I said, I wonder, did these guys think I gave them a direct order to paint that thing right there? And then I thought about it a little bit, and I thought, no, you know, they wanted to do that. That was their contribution to the war, and they wanted to just please me however they could. And I just can't say enough about the crew chiefs of the world.
We were there at the Great Escape Camp for 6 months. I got there 3 months after the Great Escape occurred. So there was talk about it, but we didn't know it by that name. All we knew, though, was they shot 50 officers for trying to escape. And there was no way to get out, because as the Great Escape proved, the only 3 guys out of the 76 that got out of the tunnel in the Great Escape escaped and got away, and they were Europeans, every one of them, 2 Norwegians and a Dutchman. I'm glad that I had a chance to fight for my country. I'm glad that I took the chances that I did. I was a foolish kid. I wanted to fly. I wanted to be in combat. I changed my mind when I got there. And as I realized that the enemy is shooting back at you with real bullets. But the point is, I think that I'm glad for what I was able to do. I would do it again.
You know, most pilots are in love with the airplane that they flew, but some of those loss rates had to do with the airplane you were flying, correct?
The loss rate, I think, was primarily the mission. But backing up, when I was in graduate school and we knew people were getting assignments, I had volunteered or indicated an interest in every airplane in Southeast Asia except the F-105. And that was based on a briefing from Colonel Yeager when he was head of the test pilot school. He described it as an electronic monster. Can't understand why the Air Force wasted their money on this thing. So I was not particularly happy when I got my assignment. But by the time I checked out in the airplane and started flying it, I started to really like it. By the time I left to go to war, I won't say I was in love with it, but I was proud I was flying it. And the more I flew it, the prouder I was. But our mission, since we only flew in North Vietnam, made us extremely vulnerable. We didn't have much, milk runs. Maybe on a bad weather day you'd do a recce down in Route Pack 1 north of the DMZ. And that was pretty easy, but I was on my 47th mission and 31 of them were in the Hanoi area. I'd already beaten the odds 2 or 3 times.
I was not going to accept that I could not do what I really wanted to do. Time and time again, throughout his life, Bob's resolve to speak and act according to his own conviction put him at odds with authority and often in very real physical danger. At the same time, that determination had everything to do with his greatness as an aviator and an American.
When they were just 19 years old, Don Casey and Jack Sinise met in U.S. Army Air Corps Navigator School in Pyote, Texas. They were deployed to Europe together with the 379th Bomb Group in February of 1944. When Jack Sinise was removed from his airplane to be trained as a lead navigator, Don Casey took his place. On June 18, 1944, Don was on a mission deep into Germany. It was his second mission in Jack's airplane and his 28th combat mission overall. Soon after leaving the target area, Don's plane was shot down and he and 4 of his crewmates became prisoners of war in Germany.
I never got to meet Colonel Olds, but he was the commander of the 8th Wing over at U-Bahn when I was flying, and they flew MiG-Cap on several missions into Hanoi that I was on. But I did not meet him personally until after the war.
So, obviously your missions were into dangerous territory, and I've read that, well, I won't get into reasons, but because of our unwillingness to stop the stuff coming in from the Russians, they had a very robust anti-aircraft defense system. So I imagine every mission was just tremendously high risk.
There were a few missions, like the when we would do road recce or just general reconnaissance missions down in the lower route packs 1, 2, or 3, that were you almost say were fun. Get out and roam around and see the countryside while you were doing it. But yes, when we went into the Hanoi area, the expression was, when you got up there, your ass belongs to Uncle Sam, put those bums on target. And there were some missions that everything's there. We went in, at the time I was there, we'd make run-ins at low altitude, around 1,500, 2,000 feet, to try to stay out of the radar for the SAMs and the radar guns. Therefore, small arms fire was a risk that you had to avoid. But yeah, in the pattern that we flew, we'd pull up to about 14,000 feet and then come back in on a dive. And that's when the radar could pick you up. Where the first month or so I was there, where the MiGs would be laying for us right over Hanoi. And one mission I was on, we had MiGs going up with us in the POP. You had 105s and MiGs and 105s and MiGs, and SAMs going off and flak all around. I don't know who the MiG leader was that day, but he wasn't too smart.
I think we've got storm clouds over Europe and I believe someday we're going to be in a conflict of war, and if we are, I want to be out there fighting. And if I accept the commission here, I'll have an O in my wing shield. And that means observation pilot, and you cannot fly combat. And I had wanted to be a fighter pilot in the worst way. And so I asked him, I said, "Sir, could you get me an assignment to flight training so I could be qualified for combat?" And he said, "Well, of course I can."
Bob had vision problems all his life. He wore fairly thick glasses for as long as I knew him. But to be a fighter pilot in World War II, you needed to begin flight training with 20/20 vision. If your vision degraded during training, you might be allowed to fly with corrective lenses, but not to start with. Once again, Bob's gift provided the way around an obstacle. The flight surgeon who would test his vision had seen him fly.
And he said, "All the Air Guard pilots tell me how skilled you are." And he said, "I want you to pass this exam, but I'm concerned that you're going to have to work awful hard to get it." So he was trying to clue me. "Sergeant," he said, "I've got a couple of things I've got to do in my office, and when I come back, I want you to read that bottom line for me." So he gave me about 30 minutes to memorize the letters and 2 lines, the 2 lower lines that I couldn't read.
It's sort of an interesting thing. I went through the same flight training as a cadet did, and when we graduated, I was still a sergeant, and all the rest of the people were officers, and they didn't have any experience like I had at all. But here I was a sergeant, and when we went into fighter training, I was made a flight leader just right off. Well, then about a month later, my commanding officer called me in, and he said, I'm putting you in charge of 67 fighter pilots, and you're headed for England.
And we did carry bombs briefly for about 30 days after the Normandy beachhead landing. Okay, check your bomb. You check the guns, and this is there's a difference on the B and the D, of course. The B model only had 2 guns, but they were also mounted differently. There's several production changes between the B and the D, but one of them, these guns are laying in here sideways, and I don't know which way they lay. Yeah, probably this way. And so the ammo doesn't feed in there directly like that, it feeds at an angle. And so we were having gun jams when you were pulling G's and firing. The guns would jam and you had no way of recharging them and all that. And we finally got that ironed out by having very clean working guns and then putting trays on top of the ammo so it wouldn't flop around. But when you're doing a walk around, you just check and make sure. They usually had tape over the things like that.
I was enthusiastic. I had high ideals and expectations because I had learned a lot of things about aviation that other people had not had an opportunity to do.
But Bob had another obstacle to overcome. The Army Air Corps' plan for him did not include flying combat.
We got to Africa, and when we arrived there, I was the first to get an assignment. And boy, I was just anxious to go. And I checked into where I had to check into, and they said, we're separating you from your men, and you're going to be testing airplanes, taking them up for their first time. They're coming overseas in ships, and we've already got 2 shiploads waiting now to be assembled. And when they get them assembled, you're going to fly them around and check them out until they're ready to go to combat. I said, boy, I wanted to go to combat.
Oh, you could almost watch a gauge drop. I used to laugh. Say, put your hand on the floorboard, you could feel it going by. I'm trying to think. Typical fuel consumption was probably about 3,000 gallons or pounds an hour. The afterburner jumped to a little over 6,000.
So you didn't do that unless you meant it?
No. The best I did, I guess I got it about 1.3 or 4. But that's an interesting story if you want to put on it.
Yeah, go ahead. I'd love to hear it.
We were on a mission on Sunday afternoon in a railroad yard just northeast of Hanoi across the Red River Bridge there. And my flight leader, we were the number 1 bomb flight, and there was a flak suppression flight ahead of us, and the number 4 guy there had been hit and was going down under the clouds. We had about a 2,000 foot level layer. And so my flight leader says, I'm going to follow him down. So that meant me leading the mission out. And about the time I got out and got to recover right across Hanoi, and that's where we were in afterburner, accelerating out of there and jinking. A SAM went off so close that I flew through the colored cloud, which only lasted a couple of seconds. And I came back and I told him that day, I said, I think the biggest damage I did was going across Hanoi Supersonic, blowing out all the windows in town. But as we got out, I was starting to climb out, and a fellow from up here in Georgia who happened to be in my squadron too, I recognized his voice, called me and he says, single 105, 18 east of 97, shake it, you got a MiG on you. So I did a split S right down through the cloud layer, pulled up, and when I did and looked out, there was a mountain ridge on either side of me out here, at least 500 feet higher than me. And I came back out of there rather subdued, to say the least. And I remember I got back and went through debriefing. And intelligence at that time, if you had a tough mission, they'd pull out this bottle of bourbon, old Overholzer, I remember, and they'd give you a shot. And I threw that one down, and I started telling him about the mission. He pulled up, said, "You like another?" And I said, "Yeah." And I says, "Can I have another one?" I had my third shot of bourbon. We got through the debrief, and I looked at my watch. It was about 5 minutes till the evening church time. And I went down to the chapel, and I knew this Methodist minister was down there, and I leaned up and right up in his face. And I said, "It was a close one today, but he got me back here." I said, "You think I'll be okay here?" He says, "You'll be glad you're here. Come on in." But that was probably my most exciting day, other than being shot down.
I guess a day you probably don't enjoy talking about, but I hope you will. July 5th, 1967, and maybe you know, I'd love for people who, particularly young people, to understand what your day was like. Not just the fact that you were shot down, but your usual day and preparing for a mission, and all you can remember about that day would be wonderful.
I don't have any trouble talking about it. July the 5th, 1967 was obviously a very special day, and 2 or 3 things led up to that, in that I had just been appointed or signed as the executive officer of the squadron, and we were having an inspection. We had a new commander. He asked me to do a check around to make sure we were ready and get acquainted myself. So I had not flown for 3 days. I had sat as spare when they needed, but I didn't get off. And I remember on the night of the 4th of July, I wrote a letter home, and I said, "Well, I missed the fireworks again today, but Fergie promised me tomorrow for sure." And sure enough, I went out on the afternoon mission. I dropped that report off on the commander's desk and headed out. And later on, talking to people in Hanoi when we were together, almost without exception, all of us acknowledged there was something different about the way we felt that day. We couldn't put our finger on it, but it wasn't like a normal day. And I kept trying to think the whole time, what have I forgotten? What did I do or not do, or what? And as it turns out, obviously it was that sense, I guess, of the impending, what was imminent. But in my case, I was the number 4 airplane in a second flight on a railroad siding right up near the Chinese border. And just as we started our roll-in of the first flight, there was a call for MiGs about 20 miles west of us at our altitude. So as number 4, that's part of my responsibility. So I took a quick look out there to see if I could pick them up. And I didn't see anything, but when I looked back, my leader had already started rolling in, and the flak was so thick that I couldn't see down. So I had to stay up till some bombs went off and I could see the target. Consequently, I had to adjust my roll-in. Instead of being in a 45-degree dive, I was probably at least 60 coming straight down, and I had to adjust the altitude, drop the bombs. And I flew through 3 levels. They were laying out flak at level 3, about 3,000 feet apart. I made it through the 3 of the levels of flak. But just as my bombs came off, I felt a hit. I'd been hit twice before, so it was unmistakable. But this time, my procedure was when I dropped the bombs, was hit the afterburner, pull out, let that give me the thrust, and start my jinking. Well, when I hit the afterburner, the airplane just did a tumble. And I came back out, it stabilized, and I remember this distinctly. Boy, that'd be a heck of a ride at Coney Island. I'd never been there, but I'd heard about it. So I relaxed, put the burner back in, get out of here, and the airplane just started flipping and tumbling. And I couldn't see out because of the flames, but I was still going to try to make it as close as I could to the water. We'd come in off the Gulf, and we're going back out that way. But about that time, the camera up in front of the dash, under the windscreen, broke loose, and I had to duck as it went over my head. And as I was looking, the instrument panel just started crumbling, and the airplane was starting to come apart. So I leaned back, put myself in position, pulled the handles, and I remember thinking nothing happened. And boom, it's gone. And I had a very interesting experience in that I grayed out. I couldn't see anything, didn't feel anything. I was just kind of floating. I thought I was dead, literally. And then I started feeling some pressure, and my vision started coming back, and I could see a little bit of green. And then all of a sudden I could see the canopy of, the tops of the trees, and I'm coming down. And I looked up to see if the canopy was open, and it was just starting to blossom. And I reached up to get it, and when I put my hands on the risers, they collapsed. I was sitting on a log on the ground. And that all took less than 2 seconds, because had those automatic systems that got me out, pull to shoot, not worked, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. I figure I went out inverted in negative G's, and probably maybe even ejected toward the ground. I don't know. No idea. But somebody up there was looking out for me that day again, like the day that over Hanoi Supersonic.
You're not any place you want to be.
Well, the first thing, obviously, that I did once I was on the ground, sitting on the log, my emergency beeper was going off. Get that off so I can talk. But I couldn't get up to it. I couldn't get it cut off. I didn't think. I realized after the fact that I had, because 2 others had been shot down, and their beepers were the ones that were going off, blocking things. But I made an immediate call. Told them I was down safe. I'd check in an hour. That's really optimistic. But sitting on the log looking down was kind of ironic. I looked down and looked at the tree. This is just like North Georgia. Those hills, same kind of scrub trees and pine trees running around, the ground's gravelly. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, these ain't going to be friendly North Georgia mountaineers. Everybody I see now may be looking to kill me. So I started trying to get rid of stuff. My chute was caught in the trees. I couldn't get it down. My survival kit that comes out separately had banged down, and I couldn't get it open. But I could get the side open that had the jungle hat with a mosquito net and a bottle, 2 cans of water. And I pulled out the water, stuck them in my flight suit, put the hat on, threw my helmet down the hill, hoping that would make them think I'd gone that way. And I started up the hill, which was the instructions or recommendations from survival school. And as I got to almost to the top of the hill, and I could see a path out here that I was going to go to, and I hesitated just long enough. I think actually my G-suit got caught in some brambles and kept me from pushing these bushes open, and a Vietnamese ran across closer than 4 feet away. The only thing, he was in a hurry or didn't look my way. So that caused me to look around a little bit and the path, and then I saw these field wires across the way. When I leaned up and looked, I'd come down right in the gun ring. There was a gun sight down here about 100 yards and another one over here about 150. And so I reconsidered my actions at this point. Don't get too carried away. But I managed to get across that path without leaving a track with the boots. And I thought if I got over on the other side and down the hill, I could hide out for that hour and check in and maybe get picked up, get out of here. And I didn't realize when I got across, all the brush was over here. I was in grass, maybe a foot and a half high. And when I got to the edge and looked down, it was a drop off into a bog. I wasn't going anywhere in that direction. So I sat down and opened one of the cans of water, and at that point I was so thirsty I didn't think there was enough water around. I took 2 sips, and I thought it was going to come out my ears, all the psychological, the shock effects. But I managed to drink it, forced it down, threw the can away, and about that time I heard voices that were gathering up over here along the trail. And they were pointing and talking, and I'd heard some shots and hollering back and forth. They'd obviously found my parachute and helmet. And so they'd eliminated that side. They'd Well, they were going to come over here, and they did, and they came out, and I did this and tried to get anything white out of sight and hide down, but I turned out I wasn't going to hide under anything. They walked up and tapped me on the shoulder and welcomed me to North Vietnam.
To be a fellow navigator with Jack and to be able to share with him the ground experience there at flying. We weren't the same plane, but at least we came back, we flew missions, we came back from missions, we shared our experiences, and we tried to keep ourselves busy so that we didn't go crazy between missions, because the mission flying was tremendously stressful, and you had to say, well, it's not going to happen to me, I'm going to keep going. And that's the way we survived the war. So when I didn't come back that day, and Jack is there waiting for the crews to come back, and we didn't come back, I'd asked him when I finally got back from the war, Jack, what was on your mind that day when we didn't come back? He said, well, I had to be philosophical about it, and he did.
Somebody comes in the barracks and said, Steve King and the boys got shot down. It isn't that you break down and cry or anything like that, because you've seen it happen, day after day or week after week before, and it happens. But you're just kind of at a loss. But at the same time, could have been me.
We had a few translators who were French, and they could communicate with them, and we had some people that could communicate with the French. Well, that's a hell of a way to build an airplane. And they assembled these airplanes, and I tell you, it was death-defying. Every time I flew, there'd be something wrong drastically, and I'd have to fly the same airplane sometimes 6 or 8 times to get rid of all the squawks, to make sure that it was ready to go into combat. That was with P-40s and P-39s.
Jim Sursely arrived home from Vietnam as a triple amputee. From the hospital in Japan, he was transferred to a hospital in Aurora, Colorado.
When I got there and you start to get healthier and you start to eat whole foods and you kind of are aware of what's going on in the world, is where you have time now to sort of think about what's really going on. You might be going to physical therapy or occupational therapy. That's going to take care of the physical needs. The psychological needs you still struggled with. Why did this happen to me? Have I been a bad person somewhere in my life? Is this a path that God chose for me? And I'll be honest with you, I struggled with that for probably 5 or 6 weeks. I prayed a lot, but I was praying for all the wrong things. I was praying for that burning bush or that bolt of lightning that was going to show me a vivid picture of what the future had in store for me. That doesn't happen in real life. What I ended up having to do was I surrendered. My prayers to God were ones that said, I'm going to go do my physical therapy, my occupational therapy. I'm going to do everything that the Army requires of me while I'm here in the hospital. And what the future has in store for me, I'm going to leave up to God. And when I did that and I surrendered, life was just much more simple from that day forward. I didn't have to worry about anything. It removed that burden from me to be constantly searching for what's next? What does life have in store for me? And it's amazing. It's like you flipped an electrical switch. The whole world changed from that point going forward.
Back home in Rochester, Minnesota, Sursely pushed himself to stay active. He enrolled in junior college. He helped to form a new chapter of the Disabled American Veterans in Rochester.
The ones that came out and got me were actually militia. They were in civilian clothes. One of them had a rifle,
I don't mean to interrupt, but these are regular North Vietnamese.
No, these are civilian. They're like militia.
Oh, okay.
They're in civilian clothes. I don't know how they fit into the system right there then, but like I say, one of them had a rifle, and they started stripping me down. And of course, when I got my pistol out over here, one of them pulls it out and looks at it. And I don't know why, it was just a sixth sense. I just happened to glance up just as he was starting to come across and hit me in the head, and I ducked and missed him. And the guy with the rifle leaned across and hit him with a butt in his chest and knocked him back. And I remember thinking, you and I are going to be friends. I don't know about the others, but I like you. But they packed me down. Well, they started me, took off my boots, stripped out everything out of the flight suit. One amusing thing, I carried a half a pack of Salems because we'd been told that Ho Chi Minh liked those, and if Ho Chi Minh did, most everybody else probably would. And I carried some Winston cigarettes too. They pulled the cigarettes out, looked at them, crumbled them up, and threw them away. And I said, well, so much for intelligence. But they started walking me, and I realized if I walked very far barefooted, my feet were not going to be in a condition to do anything else. So as we started down the trail, I started watching, and I saw a root coming up, and I hooked my foot in it and fell over and convinced them that I'd hurt myself, and I got them to carry me all the way down the side of the mountain. And we stopped in a little village. They put me in a house in the back corner on a bed. And I was there, I'd say, between 30 minutes and an hour, and he came in, tapped out, and walked back out. And I got in this, I called it a safari wagon. It was bigger than a Jeep, but not as big as you see safaris nowadays, but open vehicle with a canvas top. And they put me in the back seat, one guy on each side. They're holding my arms like this, so I wasn't tied up. But I looked up as the fellow on my left in English said, "You're now the prisoner of the Chinese Liberation Army." And what I saw in front was a picture of Mao Zedong and Lin Pao, head of the premier and the head of the People's Army. And I couldn't put my hand up and do the Marine salute, but I said something, well, okay, you really did it to yourself this time. Because I figured I was gone to China because we were that close to the border. I learned over the next 24 hours that that's why the gun sights were so good down there. The Chinese were running them all. And what we had rolled in over, literally, that got us was what we considered probably the best gun sight in North Vietnam. Of course, now I knew why. And later, in '79, when Deng Xiaoping came to this country, he acknowledged that they had 300,000 regular troops in North Vietnam for the war. So that's what they were doing. And it was also why we had been briefed about 2 or 3 weeks before that there would be no attempted rescues in the buffer zone right up near the border. That they finally acknowledged that those were the Chinese. And I'd have to say that overall, I was well treated with them. They brought me something to eat. They wanted me to do a radio broadcast, which I declined with no pressure. And that night, the commandant came in. They introduced him as the commandant. And through the translator said that if I cooperated with them, that I would be treated well, and I'd be taken to Beijing and be treated well. And I declined that kind of offer also, because in 1967, Beijing and the moon were about the same distance from Atlanta, Georgia, as far as I was concerned. I did not know, I should say, that we had an F-104 pilot that had been shot down in September of '65 who was already in Beijing. And he came home when we did, and I introduced myself to him and told him my opportunity to meet him. He said, "You made a good choice." He spent 7.5 years in solitary. And after during the 24 hours with the Chinese, when I knew, they took me around the next day to various gun sites. We'd stop someplace, and about 8 or 10 guys would come out in uniform and line up. And I called him the cheerleader. The head guy would get out his little red book, and he'd read and chant and read, and he'd chant. And the translator then would say, "The U.S. will surely be defeated. The Vietnamese people will surely be victorious. Okay, that's nice. And one thing out of that, which really surprised me, was that almost every one of these guys had a camera. And when the chanting and cheerleading was all over, they'd all gang around there, all making pictures. So I had my fingers crossed that somebody was going to make a picture to get out, because I knew with my close call I was probably going to be reported as killed in action. So I cooperated with the picture making at that point as much as possible. But that afternoon, they took me up to a place, I guess it was either a subordinate or a corresponding headquarters, where I met some more regular Army. And I had, I guess you would say, a test of wills. They started the chanting again, and this time they wanted me to say it. And I told them, no, I'm not going to say that. And one of the guys, I don't know what they smoked, but his eyes showed he had something more than issue, maybe even old Overholzer. But he comes up with his rifle and puts the bayonet right under my chin and pops it up like that, while the translator's right here saying, "You must say it." And I wouldn't shake my head, I just did kind of like that. And after 2 or 3 times like that, and for him saying, "You must say it," I finally just did my lips tight like a grim, so I'm not going to say that. And an officer obviously came up and got this guy to back off with a rifle. But I wasn't too sure there for a while, because I could see the rifle bore was clean. It was operable. But once that was over, back in the truck, back down to where I'd been before, in an area with a cave. That was my house right then. And they let me take a nap, and the commander came by and motioned like that, and went out and got in the truck and went down, and they turned me over to the North Vietnamese. And I remember when they made that offer and to go to Beijing, I said, no, I want to go to Hanoi. The guy looked at me and just kind of shook his head. So when he turned me over, I leaned back out, and I wanted to shake hands with him, and we did, which is part of the story, because I hope to meet him later on. But anyway, the Vietnamese took me, blindfolded me, and took me down, I'm pretty confident, to Kelp Airfield. And I got a jet helicopter ride into Gia Lam, right downtown, and then a truck ride across the river to the big prison, Wallow. We referred to Wallow as the Hanoi Hilton.
Oh, that's the Hanoi Hilton.
But also,
yeah,
Hanoi Hilton tends to encompass all the camps. If you were in Hanoi, you were in the Hilton. Oh. Although everybody, with few exceptions, processed through the big prison initially. And I went into New Guy Village there, learned I wasn't nearly as big, mean, tough, and strong as I thought I was. A couple of little fellas with a rope can get you to do and say things that you didn't plan to. And another one that got my arms up behind me for the better part of a day, convinced me to do some things.
Okay, from this point, you would gather up your parachute. You might even be wearing it, be a back chute. And you mount the airplane from this side, or you could come up the strut on the front.
Put me to work, and they said, okay, there's your airplane. Fly it up to Dong Ha, and you got a mission this afternoon. By the time we get on station there, then the tracers start flying up. The NVA knew the game is on. Once the artillery's coming in on station and we start firing it, then I'll get the TAC air. They'll come up on station, and then I give them a target briefing. You have to tell them which runway heading, which heading to come in on, which way to break out, what the target is, what the elevation is, where's the friendlies, where's the hostile fire. But we control the whole battle as a forward air controller. That's what we did. But when we got up to North Vietnam, it got pretty exciting up there.
And I went into the tent to do the paperwork, and they were putting all of their gear into the B-25. And a two-star general, I looked up and there he was. And he said, "Young man, I'd like to talk to you about your mission." And I said, "Sir," I said, "I came into this Air Force to fly for our country and fight the enemy." And I said, "I had a taste of it in England. And each assignment I've had since has had nothing to do with combat." And I said, "I think I'm as qualified to be a good fighter pilot as anybody could be." I said, "I can hit the target consecutively, right side up or inverted." And I said, "I can hit a target out of 4 consecutive loops. And that means every loop has to be perfectly round to be in position to fire in the target each time you come through." And it's very difficult. Most people do loops and they're sort of L-shaped. You move out. And he listened to me and he said, "Young man," he said, "that's a hell of a story." He said, "If you can really fly that well." And I said, "Well, sir, you could contact Colonel McNichol because he's watched me do these demonstrations I do." And I said, he told me if I could ever get a transfer that he'd make me a flight leader if I could get an appointment to his outfit. And he's in the 52nd Fighter Group, he commands it. He said, "Son, you'll have your orders within 2 weeks."
We got a 4-star general, General Haynes, another general coming up to Dong Ha to talk about what we had done on the 26th. All of a sudden, we don't know that there's a bombing halt coming 1 November. Everybody else knew but us. And the North Vietnamese knew that there was a bombing halt coming, and they threw everything at us. I had the last guys, the F-4s that were shot down before they went into the water. But we took so much fire. We wondered, like, what the hell is coming on?
But by and by, the stones will crumble down. Better take it with a smile and try. Take it all in stride.
Mr. President, I've been home since Friday, been to 2 dinner parties. No one asked me where I've been for the past year or what I've been doing. In case someone does, what would you like me to say? And he said, "Well, Colonel, you tell them that we are preventing the North Vietnamese from interfering in the democratic process in South Vietnam." I said, "Sir, I can't say that."
Ask yourself, are all my dreams up on a shelf? And all I have to show is this wasted time.
World War II was a total thing for America. We mobilized the entire country. In Vietnam, one of the things of the lousy war was that it was being run from the Pentagon, from Washington, from the White House. The Secretary of Defense was micromanaging everything, and it was like we didn't want to win.
Whoa, the past is gone forever. You better leave it all behind and try to take it all in.
You went over there thinking you were doing something that you were supposed to do, and you certainly did not want to be told that all the friends that you lost over there, that their lives were lost for no reason. You did not want to ever hear that, nor do I want to hear that today. And I get very wound up about that when I hear anyone talk about it in that manner, because I lost some really good friends there.
Whoa, we're only here for a short
you saying, has anybody done that? No.
It had been opened in, I think, summer, June, July area of 66. And they called it the farm because out the edge of town, and you could hear the chickens and the animals and things around, and they named the buildings for things like the barn and the stable and the chicken coop. And it was an old French movie studio, so there was a theater there, that was obvious. They had a swimming pool, and one was a pool hall. So all those names fit in. But one of the guys that was living in front of the pool hall was a real character. One day, well, almost all the doors had these little openings, and we call them peeps for short. And that's what they'd open up and look, check on you every morning and during the day or at night or whatever. One of the guards came by one day and did that. And after he walked off, this fella tapped to his neighbor next door, says, "The first zoo I've ever been in where the animals look at the people." And from then on, it was the zoo.
And boy, he put his arms around me and he said, "Oh, I've been hoping this day would come." And he said, "I've told all of the people in this fighter group about your expertise." And he said, "I want you to put on a show for all of them." And so he brought all the 3 squadrons were located in different places into Palermo. He got everybody assembled and he said, "You're going to see something you've never seen before. But I want you to know one thing. If I catch any one of these you fighter pilots trying to duplicate what you're going to witness, I'm going to have you grounded."
Bob Hoover believed, his bosses believed, and those who saw him fly fighters in those days believed he was simply the best there ever was, which makes what happened to him in combat all the more surreal.
The day I was shot down, we were dive bombing some transports, feeding supplies to the Germans in southern France there. And we were attacked by 4 Focke-Wulf 190s. And we just pulled off of the target of releasing our bombs, and we were all split up. I pulled out of a break like this, and I was up about almost 90 degrees, and I saw this Focke-Wulf out here, and I just ignored him. And about that time, I was hit. And believe it or not, it was a 90-degree deflection shot. Well, I knew I had no choice. The fire was so bad, I just rolled it upside down, and I hoped that they wouldn't hit me again. And I just rolled it upside down and fell out, hit the water, got tangled up in my parachute lines. And then I sat there in the water, and I had shrapnel that came all through the bottom of the airplane. And I was in the water all afternoon, and a German Corvette was searching for 2 of their pilots that had gone down, and they found me. And I remember for as long as I lived trying to sink my escape kit, because I didn't want the Germans to catch it. I'm sure by then they must have had hundreds of them. But it was a little encasement that had a saw blade encased in rubber, which you inserted in your rectum. And it had a map, a cloth map of the area we were fighting in. And it had some chocolate bars, some other things that could keep you from severe pain. It was a Corvette, and it had like a ladder coming down with a platform on the bottom right near the waterline. So finally they had a long pole with a hook on it, and they hooked me and pulled me onto that platform.
Not like 5.5, almost 6 years a prisoner. how did you find out you were going home and when you were going home? And tell me about that experience.
Well, to put it all in perspective, when Nixon started the bombing again in May of '72, we were in the big prison there at Wallow, and somebody that went to quiz, as we called the interrogations, because that was easier to say and to tap, brought back a message that Nixon is crazy man. We don't know what happens now. But we had in our camp 1 South Vietnamese prisoner and 3 Thai prisoners who were allowed out to work and do things, and of course they were speaking the language, and they were really our intelligence. And we got a heads up that 209 was the number, literally, were going to be moved out of camp. And sure enough, about a week later, 209 of us were moved right up to the Chinese border, deep in the mountains, and a camp that we thought initially was new to us. We learned later on that others had been there ahead of us, who I don't know. But we spent the rest of '72 there and over the winter. And in October, we didn't have radios in each cell there. They didn't have power like we had back in the big prison. We had these little radios in each room, and you got these propaganda broadcasts. Hanoi, Hanoi, we call it, the voice of Vietnam, all the garbage. Up here, they had to do it by quizzes. And one of the fellows that went early picked up, they were asking him, what do you think about this proposed end of the war, or whatever? This is in early October. And then I was called out right at the end of October. And he asked me, he said, are you disappointed there was no settlement in October? I said, no, I didn't know there were going to be one, so how can I be disappointed for something I didn't know was going to happen, wasn't going to happen anyway? And kind of went on with that. And then, over Christmas and the holiday and New Year's, it got really cold and we were settling in. All of us were looking to be there in the winter. And one night, the building I was in up the top of the hill, one of the fellows woke us up and said, we just had 3 trucks come into camp. So we all stayed up and we counted 17 trucks. You don't need that many to bring in a month's load of food. Something is up. And the guards came around that morning and let us out to go out to eat or to shave, whatever we were going to do. We had a little area, kind of a little patio we could get out to in our building. And he looks around at one of the other guys and he does this. And then he goes back like that, looks over and says, something is really up here. So we went back in, and just so we didn't miss out on it, we all started rolling up our gear. That afternoon when the guard came around and opened it up, and he gives us this, which was a signal to roll up, ready to move, we just all leaned over, patted our roll. He got a big smile on his face, and right after dark, they loaded us on the trucks, headed back to Hanoi, and about halfway down mid-afternoon, we stopped and had a little coffee break. They gave us water and little energy bars, coconut bar stuff. And instead of getting back on the truck necessarily that you were on, they divided us out in 4 categories. And what turned out to be the first 2 release groups went back to the big prison. The 3rd release group went to one we called a plantation, and the 4th one went to the zoo. And, excuse me, we'd been back about a week, and I was at the plantation in the 3rd group. They called us out one afternoon. We lined up, and the camp commander came over, and he read us the protocol from the Paris Treaty that in itself required that the prisoners be notified within 48 hours of this date. And they were told it, and they stood there for a few minutes waiting for us to do something, and when we didn't, they said, okay, dismissed, and we all filed back into our own little cells, and then we went up hugging each other. So, God, I hope it's true, hope it's true. And in my particular case, I was pulled out and taken up to Wallow. It turns out that after the first release group, there was a little difference of opinion between, the conditions for release were that everybody would be released in 4 equal increments over the next 60 days. So, and with the sick and wounded being released first. Well, the U.S. expected that to be release the sick and wounded, then 4 more increments. The Vietnamese interpreted to be the sick and wounded would be in the first increment. So they had a little hassle about that. And somehow they came up and released 20 guys, just pulled almost at random, came out. So as that was going on, I was pulled up to the second release group. Then they decided, no, the count didn't work, so I went back to the plantation. And then they pulled me out again. And whatever the problem was, we were supposed to be released on the 1st of March. And the camp commander came in, and we had the big, going away thing, special dinner, blah, 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 on the night of, last night in February. And then he told us, he said, maybe you do not go tomorrow. There is a small problem. I will let you know. So the next morning he comes in and said, I don't think so today. And that night he said, maybe tomorrow. And then by March the 3rd, we were said, oh, to hell with it. I hope somebody got out of here anyway. And he came in that night and he says, I think tomorrow, okay. And sure enough, the next morning he comes in and came in. There was a group called, I forget the exact name, but they were an Indian, a Canadian, a Czech, and another Soviet Union type. Had to come around and inspect everybody. So they came through. We figured, I think we might make it today. And sure enough, about an hour later, we started going out. We got our go-home clothes that we'd been fitted for. We went out to pick them up, put them on. And they walked us out the front gate, and they had their little 20-seat buses out there, and we all got on and headed over to Jialam for the big trip home.
The day I got out, I got a diversion going. I got some of the fellas that I'd worked with on some of the escape attempts to start a fight. And once they started the fight, got all the guards' attention, but half of the guards had deserted by then. We could hear the big guns about 50, 70 miles away. And we got to the other side, and now we were away from the Germans for the most part, out in open countryside.
After 3 days on the run in Germany, a very hungry Bob Hoover and his fellow escapee came to a farmhouse occupied by the wife of a German officer. Her husband was based elsewhere. Luckily, she spoke English. In exchange for some food, Bob wrote her a letter to give to the advancing Allied troops. The letter asked the Allies to treat her kindly because of the help she had provided him. As he was leaving, she also gave him a pistol. Bob was on the hunt for a German airplane he could use to fly himself to the Allied lines and freedom. As he continued to move around the German countryside, he was in and out of the lines of the Russian troops. The Russians were vengeful enemies. Bob witnessed unspeakable brutality inflicted on Germans by the Russians. Eventually, Bob made his way to a deserted airfield and started looking for an airplane.
Finally, I found one that was full of bullet holes, but the engine was okay, and it was full of fuel. And I said, I'm going to wait till a mechanic walks by here, and I'm going to put the gun on him and bring him in here and help him get the airplane started. And so finally, a German mechanic did come by, and I pointed the gun at him and yelled, and I motioned for him to come into the revetment, and he walked in there. Boy, he put his hands up, and his face was just pale as a ghost.
The Germans showed Bob how to start the Focke-Wulf 190 airplane, and Bob decided it would be too risky to taxi the airplane slowly out to a runway. He simply firewalled it out of the revetment where it was parked.
Well, I let it go, and I went straight out of that revetment, got airborne, got the gear up, and there was a 4,000-foot ceiling. And I no more than got off the ground, and I started thinking, you know, this is the dumbest thing you've ever done. Here you are in an enemy airplane, and the war's not over, and our Air Force people come in and see you. They're going to take an easy pot shot at you, and you did. And I headed north till I got to the North Sea. Then I swung west, and I thought, if I've got enough fuel to get to Holland, I'll see windmills, and I'll know I'm in safe country.
Bob had eventually landed the German airplane in a field in Holland. What he had no way of knowing was that under Nazi occupation, the Dutch population had experienced the highest per capita death rate of any country occupied by Hitler's forces. Now that they had been liberated, the local population was not likely to warmly welcome a pilot who had emerged from a German airplane. He was immediately surrounded by farmers with pitchforks and other weapons. They were marching him down a road when they encountered a British convoy. Bob was able to describe his situation to them, and the Brits intervened.
It was sort of a hair raiser and a very dumb thing to have done. You know, the war was practically over, but all I'd thought about every day, all day long, was getting out and capturing one of their airplanes, and I was just so motivated.
The day Bob Hoover stole that German airplane and flew himself to freedom, he was 23 years old.
I'd like to hear this.
Well, we got out there as we pulled out onto the ramp, and I saw that 141 out there. Of course, working out there, my neighbor at Craig had gotten out of the Air Force and was test pilot in 141, and I'd walked out into one just before I left to go to Southeast Asia. And I saw that airplane, the United States of America, and that big flag up there. And I told a lot of people, when I walked down and walked up that ramp, I could smell the red clay out of North Georgia. I knew I was going home.
Is that just an expression, or did you really feel like you smelled?
I started feeling like I'm headed home, yeah.
Well, the one question I want to ask you, the penultimate, next to the last, is a lot of things changed for you while you were a prisoner. You found out about losing your father and losing other family members and your wife. And again, if you don't mind my asking, what sustained you through that?
Well, I had premonitions, or indications, I guess you'd say, on both. I only got 2 letters from my wife, and they were 6 lines, but she only used about 4 of them. So all she just said was, the children are fine, they help a lot. Another one was, I moved to Atlanta to go to Emory, the children doing well. You could almost read into it the indifference. And in the case of my dad, the one thing that I got from my mother was a birthday card that was signed Love, Mother. And that was probably one of the really low points when I realized he was gone, because I was looking forward to seeing him. I knew he was in bad shape when I left, but I was looking forward to going back and seeing him again. And so when I got there to Clark, we'd been there, 3 or 4 hours, and they came around and got me and said, there's a colonel up here wants to see you. And he introduced himself from 13th Air Force headquarters. And we were standing in the doorway to the little ward area that I was in, and I looked up, and a technician that had been seeing me around was leaned up to the desk up here about 20, 30 feet. And I don't know why I turned around. There was another technician back standing around over here. This is not going to be a standard conversation. What is it? So he started out casually, told me about my aunt dying and my uncle dying and my father-in-law dying, and then your father died, and your wife got a divorce. And as I've described it, it wasn't a surprise, it was the shock of confirmation. The things I was hoping weren't true, but I had a sense. And it was kind of ironic when I learned about more detail about my wife's divorce. When I was up in the mountains and I hadn't gotten anything, heard anything, I went to a quiz and I asked an officer whom I'd known from way back at the zoo. I said, I hadn't heard anything from my wife in a long time. I said, I'm wondering if maybe something has happened. He said, no, I think everything's fine. And I said, well, I would really like to know. I don't want my children to be hurting or having any problem. He said, okay, I asked. And several months later, I went to quiz with him again, and he said, I asked. He said, I think everything okay. As it turns out, that first quiz was within a week of when she filed for the divorce, and the second one was within a week of when it was granted. And they had sent the paperwork to Hanoi to Camp of Detention, and since I didn't reply within 30 days, I wasn't contesting it.
When you first lose your freedom, and I've said this to so many young people, you don't know what we have here in this country till you can't see that red, white, and blue flag. You don't know what that stands for. That's freedom.
Most of the people that I've talked with, they're interested a little bit about my military career. As you know, I started flying the B-17 August the 4th, 1943. I went to Europe in June. I got in there in June the 12th of 44. Had 520 hours total time. And I flew a couple of missions around England just to get a feel for the whole thing. And then on June the 21st, I had my first mission, and it was to Berlin. Now, everything was backwards with me in the Air Force. I wanted to fly P-38s, so they gave me B-17s. I wanted to fly a bomber to Europe and come back on a ship. So you know what happened. I went over to the ship and flew back. I wanted to get a couple of missions into occupied territory, some short ones, and get a feel for the whole thing. So the first thing they did was they gave me the longest one, and that was to Berlin. And then, of course, I got shot down on a milk run, which I wanted in the first place. So everything was backwards, but you got to look at it a different way. I'm still here.